we might get ourselves to a place where we have a healthy definition of vulnerability. But as leaders, we know that we might be leading some people who still see vulnerability as weakness, therefore removing the competency and authority in their minds. So how do we really then lead through vulnerability and maintain competency and authority for the people that we lead? How does that look? Is there a balance? How does this work? It might help if we define a couple of words: authority and vulnerability. And I know I just said, but what if our definitions are different for other people? And why should we spend so much time on definitions? Well, we spend time on definitions because the way we define something is the way that we frame it. And the way that we frame it develops a belief. And that belief can turn into conviction, a strongly held belief that drives our behaviors, that drives and motivates decisions, that creates our core values, that then contribute to a culture that you create inside and outside of your organization, or inside and outside of the groups of people that you lead, even in your own family. So it's important to look at what we've defined and how we've defined it. Now, what if we differ? Like I said at the beginning, our definition is different than the people that we lead in their definitions. Well, I think if we look at it and we start by looking at what we could agree upon as definitions, then the decisions and behaviors that leads to might help to shift and shape their definitions. So first, let's define the word authority. What if we used a definition that I heard on a podcast where authority is defined as the ability or capacity to take meaningful action? The ability or capacity, power to take or make meaningful action. Okay, so now what if we defined vulnerability as meaningful exposure or risk? Last week, we talked about leading through vulnerability, and we talked about vulnerability having intention and purpose with the people that we lead. So I like this definition that was shared in this podcast of meaningful exposure and risk. I define the difference between raw vulnerability and the vulnerability that shows up that we lead through. The raw vulnerability I'm going to get to in just a little bit, and how that plays into leadership, what we do with it. But if we start with those definitions, then I saw a quadrant shared by this same guy that was doing this podcast. I'm going to add some thoughts to what he shared. And let's dive into authority and vulnerability, the relationship that they play, and then some actions, what that means for you and me as leaders. So if we look at this 4-quadrant, we've got the authority high at the top, and then at the bottom it's low authority. We've got strong vulnerability over on the right with zero vulnerability, or at least we think, on the left. So if we look at the bottom left quadrant, we're looking at low vulnerability, low authority. This is really like babies. There's safety. Now, we could argue and say, actually, babies are very vulnerable, but they're being protected, right? Their exposure and their risk are being protected and guarded usually by parents. So that's not a perfect analogy, because there are babies in circumstances that are not being protected. But for the sake of what we're talking about today, that quadrant is where we feel safety. If the vulnerability is low and our authority is low, we are not responsible. It makes us feel like we don't have to take action that could expose us. We don't have to be in charge. We can withdraw, which we'll talk about later. So that safety quadrant is where a lot of us begin and where a lot of us want to go back to. Okay, then if we go over to the bottom right, it's low authority and high vulnerability. And this is where suffering happens, where victimization happens. This is where you and I can make ourselves victims based on circumstances and things that we've experienced, where we give authority away. Sometimes authority is taken, definitely, but sometimes it's given. And so then we are in this place where we feel under oppression, under pressure, under. And so then it leaves us feeling suffering. It makes us feel turmoil and pain. Suffering is kind of like the big picture word, right? Okay, upper quadrant. If we go upper left, high authority, low vulnerability, that's where we are delusional in our thinking in that we can have full control. Zero vulnerability. Let's mitigate the risk. Let's eliminate the risk. Let's control the PR and exposure and control the narrative, thereby giving us this sense of like, all is right, all is good. Now, this quadrant is actually where a lot of leaders flock to, and a lot of action takers will drive towards. Successful people move to that quadrant. We'll get there in a minute. Top right quadrant is high authority mixed with high vulnerability. And we could say that this is where flourishing happens. This is where leaders should grow to. This is where leaders should operate out of. So let's talk a little bit more about these quadrants and how they play out, and then what that means for you and I as leaders, and how we put it into practice. I'm sure you've got a story. I've got a lot of chapters to my story where we found ourselves in the bottom right quadrant and it didn't feel safe. And we were exposed and it didn't even feel meaningful. And we didn't choose it. And so our nature is gonna escape it. We wanna escape that feeling of vulnerability. And so we scramble for ways and ladders out of that place. And instead of going, I'm going to surrender to it, ask God to use all of it, I'm going to humble myself and then take the power back appropriately, right? Faithfully, and kind of stay on that right side. Instead, we scramble to the upper left side for control. So control can look like excellence. Control can look like success. Control can look like you've got it all together. Control can look like authority. Control could look like strong leadership. But the motive and the heart posture is where it's vulnerable, because control can lead to burnout because you take the weight of the world on your shoulders. Control can lead to mismatch and priorities out of order and a mismatch of core values, leading you to disillusionment, that you've got success, but you don't have happiness. So control, while we think it feels better momentarily, it doesn't lead to good places. And it's really a heart posture and a perspective that is unhealthy, especially for a believer that believes that there's a God bigger than us, that what we do and who we are is beyond what it does for us, right? So we scramble to find control. And then when we feel like we're losing it, when we feel like we are exposed and vulnerable and we didn't choose it, we didn't surrender to it, then we'll withdraw down to safety. We'll pull back. And I'm sure you've got parts of your story where you can see yourself scrambling for control or withdrawing to safety. I definitely could tell you that there are times that for survival, I fought for control or I withdrew to protect myself. But what we did in survival should not become who we are, right? That was a stage. It shouldn't be the state that we operate out of. But it's common, and you'll find a lot of leaders in that struggle. You'll find also then the fight that I mentioned in the beginning, like if I expose myself, even if it's meaningful, am I losing authority then in the mind and the eyes of the people that I lead? It's a valid question. I've questioned it myself. In the last video, I talked about the difference of vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity. Authenticity is we show up with self-integrity. We are who we are no matter who we are with or what circumstances we're in, and we are aligned with our core values as much as possible. Transparency is an honesty, right? You're not hiding things. And there's appropriate times to be fully transparent, full disclosure. And then there's vulnerability, and there's the raw vulnerability. And this guy called it hidden vulnerability because as a leader, there are certain things that we don't expose. There are certain things that we don't bring and put out in front of the people that we lead, but they're still there. There's still things, the raw, vulnerable places that we as leaders have to process. We just can't do it with the people that we're leading. And so we find ourselves as leaders feeling fairly isolated because you've got these hidden vulnerabilities that can make you then retreat and withdraw, or it can burn you out because you can't control them, or you can't move over into that other vulnerable spot. So you're processing it alone. And what I would say with those hidden vulnerabilities and raw vulnerabilities is that's where you and I have to find someone outside of our organization. We need to have an inner circle that is aligned with our core values that helps us process, because they're like-minded, like-hearted, right? They help us process those raw places. That's what I do as a coach, is I help people process, those leaders process those hidden and raw vulnerabilities that show up as a leader, that we need to deal with and work out and work through, but we just aren't going to do it with the people that we lead. So I wanted to acknowledge that there is a time and a place for that. And then there's the vulnerabilities that we choose as a leader. We choose authenticity. We choose transparency. We choose humility, right? And we choose sacrifice. We choose to serve and come under the people that we lead even, which then moves us into that vulnerability spot. And that's where we could actually define the vulnerability as a chosen vulnerability, that it's something that we make friends with, that we lean into, that we use, that we lead through, but we have to choose it on a daily basis. So if we're choosing vulnerability, how do we then as a leader maintain that authority or that competence so that we're up in that upper right quadrant where we're flourishing, and so is our team? And I think it comes down to the definition that we stated about authority, about the capacity or ability to make meaningful action, which then will have meaningful impact. It's looking at ourselves as servant leaders, where we use our power to empower. So when we use our capacities to equip, to empower, to train, to resource, to give power to, so that somebody comes out of the suffering category, that they grow out of the safety, right? Or they are challenged out of the control and they move over to a chosen vulnerability and surrender. As leaders, we can challenge the other three quadrants, equipping them and empowering them and resourcing them and educating them and laying out tracks and setting up boundaries. We can pull people from those into the flourishing category. And if we are doing that, if we are helping others thrive, then they're not going to look at you as an authority that's untouchable, that's unreachable, that's disconnected. They're going to look at you as their biggest champion, right? And so it is a relational authority that is established because you care deeply, but you challenge directly. It's not just a positional authority that can happen in that upper left quadrant because I am the boss. I have the capacity to make all of the decisions. I have the power. It's using your power to empower. So it leaves me with 4 things that we can put into action, 4 things that we can ask ourselves and reflect on as leaders. The first is, who do I have to process the raw and hidden vulnerabilities as a leader to help me grow and to help me work through those things? The second would be, if we're looking at vulnerability as intentional, meaningful exposure and risk, what does that mean for what we believe about ourselves? What does that mean for what we believe about our position? Maybe it's more of a steward versus an owner. Maybe it's a surrendered posture. Maybe it's acknowledging that we're not in control ever and that we are dependent upon God. So what does vulnerability mean for you, and how can you choose it? We got to study it. We got to learn about it. We got to reflect on it. We got to practice it. Third thing would be, how can we be intentional to use our power to empower? Who is in our circle of influence as a leader that we can do this with? Now, I'm not talking just about the people that you serve, because a lot of you and a lot of the people I work with, the businesses that you own or the organizations that you run, by nature are empowering the people you serve, like your clients, your customers, your service base. I'm also talking about the people that you are peer level with or that are your team on the inside. How can you empower your team, the people that you lead? Use your power to empower. Empowering is not just handing over the keys to a 15-year-old and without any training, any practice, any oversight, and going, go ahead, go drive. That's not empowering. That's giving power over that is exposing them to a risk that is not appropriate. So you're setting them up for failure. So some people think, I'm just going to delegate and empower and just give it to you and just let you run because I trust you. And they think that that's the way to empower people. I'd say that's the way to set people up for burnout and massive failure that's hard to recover from, because there's no process of how do I process my failure and how big is the failure, right? Like allowing failure is also a part of empowering because it's releasing control. So it's allowing them to fail within boundary, within training, within some safety, within kind of some parameters. It's because you're equipping them. So how can you intentionally empower people with your power, with your capacity, with your abilities as a leader? And lastly, this is a self-reflection thing and being aware of when you're trying to take control. When you start to have fear, anxiety, when you operate out of urgency and panic, when everything is a now sort of a thing, when you're always putting out fires, when it's always like go, 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 go in the moment, when you're hustling, right? When you feel like everything revolves and relies upon you, we get in these frames of mind that are self-check of like, man, am I controlling this? Am I not just stewarding something, but trying to willfully make things happen, right? So there have to be some red flags and warning signals that we set up, some rumble strips that warn us when we're moving to the control quadrant. Because remember, we stay in that quadrant, and I mean, you probably know the verse, pride comes before a fall. Control builds pride in what we build, in the success we create, right? So there can be a big fall from that. Also, you can be so successful, but so unhappy, because that's not where flourishing happens. And then also you could lose control like that. The pandemic is an example of that. And that can completely throw you off your rocker because you've built your identity around this idea that you can control something. And then you can also burn out because you can't run at that pace. You cannot control everything. So that quadrant's not one that you want to hang out in. So I think we got to set up some rumble strips and acknowledge and notice some patterns that we have that pull us back there, that tempt us back to the control quadrant. And something that might be one of your red flags is that you withdraw, that you just pull back, that you stop talking to the people that you love, you stop doing the things that are good for you, you stop taking care of yourself in the ways that you know that you should, right? You're not following the patterns and the habits that you know lead to flourishing. You're worried about your reputation more than your character. And then we withdraw. That's the fourth piece, is that you and I have to have some built-in rumble strips and awareness. Otherwise, we are that exposure and vulnerability that we're not choosing. It'll come without a choice, and we're going to find ourselves in the bottom right quadrant where it's an opportunity to learn. But burnout, anxiety, depression, disillusionment, discontentment, all of those things, that high success, but a marriage failure is going to put us in that bottom right, suffering. I hope that this was helpful for you. listening to that podcast. I've been contemplating all of these things for a long time, and I loved that quadrant. So I hope this quadrant helps put some things practically into your mind and help you define some things to help build some belief that shifts some behaviors and decisions that you make. There's more of this kind of conversation that I have weekly. I send out emails to the group of people that want to grow. They want to grow themselves and they want to grow their leadership. I send it out weekly. I'd love for you to be on that list so that we can dialogue together and grow together. I also help people, leaders that find themselves in these positions where they are choosing vulnerability, they are using their authority appropriately, but they're navigating all the real world stuff that we face as leaders and making decisions of how do I not just grow myself, but how am I growing my team and the mission and the things that we are trying to move toward and grow toward. This is what I do as a coach. So I would love to help you. So make sure that you look in the descriptions below. If you're on my website, make sure you go to the contact page, reach out to me, get on that email list, and let's grow together, because I believe what's put in you needs to come out of you. And I believe it's meant for your flourishing, but also the flourishing of other people. You're a leader. It's what you do.